Hello and welcome back. Today we are diving into genetic vocabulary. Now I'm going to give you a heads up right now that this set of notes is super vocab heavy. It's pretty much only vocab. But all of the words that we're going to cover in this set of notes, we are going to use from now until like the end of the year. They're very important. So I do want you to take your time with this and really try to grasp the concepts that we're talking about. So let's get started. Genetics itself is all about heredity, and heredity is just this idea of passing traits from parents to offspring. This is why children look like their parents, right? Because all of the traits that the parents have are passed on to their offspring. And genetics is the study of heredity, the study of this passing of traits. This picture is just sort of like possible traits that could be passed on, right? Detached earlobes, we'll talk about that more in class, whether you're right or left-handed, whether you have dimples, whether you're colorblind, all of these things are traits that are passed on from your parents. A super brief history of genetics is really all we're going to talk about is Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is an Austrian monk. He is the guy that's pictured in the image, and is considered the father of genetics. So he was the one that originally sort of put down into words what he was seeing when he was studying pea plants. So he predicted how traits are passed from one generation to the next. He looked at pea plants, he took two parent pea plants, he reproduced with them, and then studied what was happening in the offspring of those reproductive matings. He only studied one trait at a time, so even though he was studying pea plants and there was a number of different traits that he was looking at, in each experiment, it was only one trait. This allowed him to have control of the experiments, and we weren't looking at, potentially outlier information or anything like that. It was really well controlled. Now, let's get into the vocab and words that maybe you've never heard of or you don't know how to pronounce, and that's okay. I'm here to help you with that. So, our first vocab word is allele. That is pronounced allele. So, this is how we describe genetic traits. An allele is a different form of a gene. It's usually represented by letters, and you'll see that in the next couple of slides, but when we're talking about alleles, we're just talking about traits that have different forms. So an example of this is a trait that we could look at is hair color in humans. The alleles of that trait would be black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, red hair, right? So the trait itself is just hair color. It's a very broad way to describe a trait. The alleles are the more specifics, the specific versions that we're going to be looking at when looking at this trait. So describing genetic traits, there's two big ways that we describe it. The trait is either dominant or it's recessive. And you've probably heard these words in maybe an alternative way. You've heard them in other classes. You know what the word dominant means, maybe not recessive, but you've probably heard the word dominant. Like, ooh, that smell is really dominating the room, right? It's like really smelly. A dominant allele is an allele that's visible or expressed. So when you have a dominant allele, you always see it, right? It shows up in the physical trait, right? So we represent that by a capital letter. A recessive allele is an allele that's hidden or masked behind the dominant allele. So even if it's there, if there's a dominant allele there, that dominant allele is going to like overpower, right? It's going to show, and the recessive allele is going to be hidden away. So we represent the recessive allele with a lowercase letter. And you can see that here when we're looking at seed shape, just looking at pea plants like Mendel did. If we're looking at seed shape, we have round and we have wrinkled. And you can see that we're going to use a capital R for the round shape because that's our dominant allele. So we use a capital R. Because we are looking at the same trait, right? We're looking at seed shape. We're looking at the same trait. We're going to use the same letter. It's just that the dominant version, round, is going to be capital, and the wrinkled version, the recessive version, is going to be a lowercase letter. We do not use different letters for the same trait that we are looking at. So if we're looking at seed shape, We're only going to pick one letter, and we're going to pick a capital letter and the lowercase letter, and we're going to use that singular letter per trait. It gets way too confusing if we start bringing in all the letters of the alphabet, so we don't do that. Now there's also ways that we can combine alleles. Okay, so we're going to keep with our same example, and we'll talk about it at the end of this, but there are two terms that we're going to use for allele combinations: homozygous and heterozygous. Now, homozygous means that you have the same or two of the identical, I love that word, right? I bold it all the time. You should definitely make note that homozygous means identical or the same traits for, same alleles for a trait. We also sometimes call this being pure or being a purebred. And what this means is that both alleles that we're going to be looking at are going to be the same, right? It's either two capital letters or two lowercase letters, but they are the same type of letter, right? Two capitals or two lowercase. Heterozygous just means the opposite of that. So two different alleles for a trait. We sometimes call this a hybrid or to be a carrier. And this just means that we have a capital and a lowercase letter together, all right? So when we're looking at these allele combinations, and I have them up on the right-hand side here, right, we're still looking at seed shape, and so we have our round seeds, which could be homozygous dominant, right? Homozygous meaning the same, dominant meaning capital letter, so homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive, right? Homozygous meaning the same, recessive meaning lowercase. That would be two lowercase r's. Now, this trait can also be heterozygous, and that would be one capital and one lowercase. Well, because it has that one capital letter, meaning that it has a dominant allele, it's going to show the dominant trait. Okay, so even though it has a recessive allele, it doesn't matter. That recessive allele is being masked by that dominant allele. Now, I keep saying, you know, this idea of it's showing round, it's showing wrinkled. Well, you already know that there is a word for that. You knew it. You saw it coming, right? Vocab is so important. And so for our last bit of vocab for these notes, we're going to talk about the terms we use when describing the genetics and the physical appearance of traits. So the physical appearance of an organism, we call that a phenotype, right? Physical starts with P, phenotype starts with P. Hopefully that helps you remember it. Phenotype is the physical, and that's usually represented by word descriptions, right? Like blue eyes or round seeds or wrinkled seeds, right? The words that we're using to describe it. The genotype, and it has the word gene pretty much in it. The genotype, those are the actual genes of an organism, or the alleles that are making up that organism, right? This is the genetic makeup for the trait. And this is usually represented by letters, right? Those capital R's, that capital and lowercase, all of that. The R's that we're looking at in our example throughout the past couple of slides, those are the genotypes. Whether it's round or wrinkled, that's the phenotype. So again, just really, really quickly, for our example of round and wrinkled shapes, we have round seeds. Round is our phenotype, and there are two possible genotypes for this. We could have homozygous dominant, two capital R's, right? Homozygous meaning the same, dominant meaning capital letters, or heterozygous, heterozygous meaning different. And again, you don't have to say dominant or recessive when you're saying heterozygous because it's just one of each. So you know it's going to show the dominant, but you don't have to say heterozygous dominant. Like that's like redundant. I've got the word recessive in my mind, so it's redundant to do that just because it's just too many words. You don't need to do that. And then for our wrinkled seed, right, wrinkled is our phenotype, meaning that's the physical trait, right? You can see that here, it's wrinkled. And our genotype is homozygous recessive, meaning two lowercase letters. I know this was a lot. We're going to practice way more in class with this, but good job, and I'll see you next time.